Thank you so much for coming to the last D seminar of the semester. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Miles Silman. Miles has a PhD in zoology from Duke University and is now an Andrew Savin Family Foundation Professor of Conservation Biology at Wake Forest University. Dr. Silman also serves as Director for the Center of Energy, Environment, and Sustainability at WFU. And his talk today is titled Natural and Unnatural Controls on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Function in the Andes Amazon.
Thanks. Thanks, Alex, for introducing me, and thank you all for inviting me to talk here. It's great to be at State. It's great to see some old friends and see some new people, and it's been really exciting, the conversations that I've had today. So it's been some great science. And I want to tell you guys a little bit about the work. So I was asked here to talk about my work on tropical forest dynamics. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about natural and unnatural controls on biodiversity and ecosystem function in the Andes Amazon, and talk about some of the work that we've been doing for the last 30 years at the Andes Amazon transition. And I first want to acknowledge, you can see there's a long list of people up here. So there's a work I'm going to talk about today, but it's all been through a bunch of wonderful collaborations. And the other thing too that I'll come back to in the talk, but for me it's kind of exciting and an honor to talk in a department where there's a lot of cooperative extension, because I think cooperative extension and the land-grant university are some of America's best ideas and are really important, as I hope you'll see, for ways to have effective policy. I don't have 228 slides, I promise you. All right. So let's get rid of all the words. So this is Abu Cognac Y. It's on the east slope of the Andes near Machu Picchu, near Cusco, Peru. Some of the highest growing forests on the planet is polylepis forests. And what you can't see is the Amazonian plain. So in a clear day, you would be out looking across the Amazon, and 4,000 kilometers away would be the Atlantic Ocean. And you can't see them because of the clouds that are there. And so those clouds evaporated off of the Atlantic. They were advected onto the Amazonian plain. They fell as rain in eastern Brazil. They were taken up through the roots of plants and passed out through their leaves, or evaporated off the plant body, went into the atmosphere, fell out as rain again, and repeated that process by the time they get to this part of the Andes and Amazon, on average 3 times. And so you can see that any disruptions in this, so it's a beautiful example of the hydrological cycle, and also the long-term links that you can get across these Amazonian plains. And so I put this slide up because when here we think about the Amazon, and we go back and we step back and we look at the way the world is. And I guess maybe because I'm old, but I think as ecologists, we tend to think of the world like this, and we learn about the way that the water cycle and the temperature distribution on the Earth set the biomes. And so this is the view of the Earth we learn in 3rd grade. And what it turns out is that the world, we were lied to when we were young. And when we go up in a satellite and look at the world, what we see is it looks like this. And so this is croplands recovered from satellite remote sensing. And if we look at the top, any of the dark areas are cropland. So basically anywhere it's wet enough to grow crops, there are crops. And any place where it's too dry to grow crops, you have grazing. And there are a few spots on the map. So you can think about the Congo, you can think about the Amazon and some high latitude areas where you don't have this pervasive influence of humans. But when we think about it, so 4 or 5 out of every 10 molecules of CO2 that are fixed in photosynthesis are fixed in human-dominated systems. Human dominate a vast area of the landscape. And all the rest of biodiversity on the planet has to get along with us and live in our areas. And today I want to go in and take a look at a few of the high biodiversity areas, but land use, again, pervasive and a pervasive control on global biodiversity. And of course, the thing that we talk about more than land use now, and we talk about climate and climate change. And so this is a figure that's now familiar. And just put it up there to think about the distribution of predicted temperature change on the planet. So you have the different amounts of carbon that we're going to put into the atmosphere from low to high. We're kind of on the lower trajectory now, and you look around the world, and of course at high latitude, your eye is immediately drawn to high latitude changes. And you think, oh, the polar bear is gonna take it in the neck. And these temperature changes are profound. Like I think about my kids were born in the climate of Winston-Salem. And if they live there their entire life, when they die, they're going to die in the climate of North Florida. So it's a big change on short timescales. But this is a kind of an erroneous way to think about the impacts that climate change is going to have on the world. So this is a study by Jack Williams, and it's been updated. But here you take two scenarios, kind of a lower carbon scenario, the thing we hope to be on, and then a higher carbon scenario. And you look at two things. So you bust the world up into grid cells. You take a grid cell now, and then you look at the climate that's going to be in that you take that grid cell and you look at the predicted climate in 2100, and you see how different it is from any place on Earth. So it could be right there, or it could be, on a different continent. And that's an index of novel climate. So the red means that those are climates that are going to be in those areas that are distinct from any place that are on Earth now. And then you have the inverse. You can look at the climate now and see whether that climate's going to exist anywhere on Earth. And when you do that, when you look at the amount of climate change, your eyes immediately drawn to the tropics. That is, the tropics are going to be the places that have climates that disappear and have climates that are novel. When we look at the scale of the entire planet. So the future climates are most different at low latitudes, high biodiversity areas, particularly tropical mountains. And it's going to have big effects on species distribution, communities, and diversity. And it already is, especially when we think about ecosystem services. So this study makes the assumption that you could take a species from Central America, and if that climate would exist in Siberia, that you could FedEx that individual over to Siberia and it would be fine in 2100. And if you factor in limited distribution, what you see is that at low latitudes, these climates are going to be exceptionally different. In the future, most species in the areas of highest diversity just won't have a home. And we're on a trajectory to have a world that's different from the beginning of the 21st century as the last ice age is to now. So what I want to talk about today is atmosphere and land use, these two things. And I want to talk about a story in applied ecology in three parts. So I'm going to give you an introduction to the Andes Amazon as a system and talk about its threats, its structure and its threats. Then I'm going to talk about species and ecosystem responses to climate change in the Andes Amazon in the forests, and take a case study and Andes and Amazon forests through time and space. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the paleoecological work that first taught us about the climate change in these forests, and then think about ongoing climate change, forest response, and then particularly drought and canopy emergent trees. And then I'm going to switch over and talk about another set of work. So I'm going to talk about a case study in ecosystem and societal transformation. I'm going to talk about a gold rush on the Amazonian frontier. And what I'll leave you with is that these gold rushes are happening all over the planet. It's one of the major forms of conversions of environments on Earth, and happening with the same technologies that happened in California and even North Carolina hundreds of years ago. So talk about how we understand the problem and approach for addressing it, and then the global scope. So this is South America, the interesting parts of South America taken from the space shuttle. So this is SRTM data, just pushing microwaves down at the Earth, taking the reflections. White is high and dark is low. And you can see the Andes in the west. You can see the sediments being eroded out of the Andes and the anastomosing form of the Amazon River. So we'll focus in on the Western Amazon and take you down to our study site. So this is taken in the Department of Madre de Dios, Peru. This is at Los Amigos Biological Station. You're standing on a tower above the canopy, looking up at the Andes. The mountains you see there are higher than Denali. And this is an exceptional area of tropical wilderness. So that's a place where you can go see the world like Lewis and Clark saw the world when they crossed the Rockies. And just to give you an idea of diversity within your field of view in this scene is 1 out of every 9 bird species on the planet. If we take trees, and when I think about trees bigger around than a wine bottle, so 10 centimeters DBH. Within your field of view will be somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 different species of trees. So it's a concentrated area of biodiversity. And I put this slide in because it's beautiful. So it's taken at our field site at Cochicashu, Peru. And it's the Milky Way. But in addition to being pretty, it reminds us that there are more trees in the Amazon basin than there are stars in the Milky Way. And when we think about the fundamental laws of biodiversity and how that works out, we end up getting the prediction that there should be about 16,000 species of trees that are in the Amazon. We've found we, meaning the community and collectors going all the way back to von Humboldt, have found about 11,000 of them. And so what there is there are these 5,000 species of trees out there that are vanishingly rare. so rare that they defy our ideas of population biology. And they're really like dark matter. They're needles in a vast haystack. Yet when we look at the other side of the laws of biodiversity and what they tell us about these forests, and it's really cool, you look at all of those numbers of individuals, and if you know 227 species, you'll know 50% of the individuals in the Amazon, even though there's another 15,000 and however many species there. So there's really interesting distribution of diversity. And of course, these plants are all doing things. So now we all talk about functional traits and ecosystem function. And these plants are moving water, they're moving carbon, they're storing carbon, and they with teleconnections that echo around the world. And of course, the forests are functional too in their animals. So they have intact fauna. This is a jaguar picture taken on the banks of the Monterey River by one of my students. And we can take a look at his functional traits. And those canines and the predation of this animal is important for regulating and also being regulated by animals that then feed on other things. So you have these trophic linkages. And if you remove parts of this, you'll get a very different forest out. So non-human animals aren't the only things that live in the Amazon. This area is also interesting when we think about the Western Amazon because it's home to a large number of people still living in isolation. So these are chozas, fishing huts of people on the Los Amigos River. And here's another group of people that are just starting to become into the initial phases. This was taken by tourists on a river near Manu National Park. And there's a picture that you all may have seen. This one was taken from the BBC, and it was in the same area in the Peruvian-Brazilian border, and it was talking about uncontacted Indians. But if you look, you can see that it's not uncontacted totally, that these are people who are living in isolation. But here you see an enameled pot, there you see a machete. So these are people caught between two worlds. And when we think about conservation, when we think about protecting these Amazonian landscapes, it adds another level of management. And then what do we owe these kinds of people? And so up here, if you go out west, you have be careful of the bear signs. And if you're traipsing around the woods in the southwestern Amazon, now there's what to do when you run into isolated people. So it's a diverse landscape. It's also a landscape that's under threat. And when we tend to think of threat, we think, okay, logging, or this is the kind of the thought. But when we look at the Amazon, it's mainly being converted by agriculture and deforestation, and then subsequent burning. And these fires are what you hear about in the news. And these fires, as they escape and move into the surrounding forests, can create a fire cycle. So a major part of land degradation. One you don't hear about as much, though, is gold mining. And it turns out that there are gold rushes throughout the Amazon. If you look at the Department of Madre de Dios alone, 150,000 hectares have been deforested in the last 30 years or so, just to get gold. And it's one of the fastest growing modes of deforestation, and then one that I'll tell you is incredibly destructive. So I want to move in and tell you about the Andes Amazon as the study system. So I'm going to take you back in. So this is the area that you saw in black and white. We'll add forest into it. So this is the study area I'll talk about in both parts of the talk. And I'll talk about modern ecology. So about 85 hectares of plots in Peru, and an additional bit in Bolivia here in Madidi National Park. So another 45 plots there. And some regional data from the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And then some paleo work informed by a large series of lakes that we've been able to look at to look at how these systems changed in the past. And I just want to take you through the study site from ABERG, the Andes Biodiversity and Ecosystem Research Group. And this is our focal study system in Eastern Peru. So it's 23 forest plots, about 19,000 individuals, again, greater than 10 centimeters DBH, much of them along a single ridge in this valley. And so we use this as our laboratory. It has short geographic distances and to do basic biodiversity inventory. And just on this one transect, we found 1,255 or so species. And in a minute, I'll tell you, but the number that remains unidentified are still striking. There's a lot of discovery that goes on. So we have plots clustered in the Andes. These are the ones I was just talking about. And then as we go further down, we can see it's embedded with a large network of plots. It makes a nice natural laboratory for studying forest ecosystem processes. When we look at the basic climate of the region, so if we go up in elevation, starting in the lowlands, the lowest part in this area is around 200 meters. when we go all the way up to tree line up around 3,800 meters, you can see that rainfall at the base of the Andes is incredibly high. So you get 5-6 meters of rain a year. And when you look at temperature, temperature is almost a perfect proxy for elevation. So as you go up, temperature decreases. There's some interesting features along here. So one of the main things that happens right at about 1,500 meters, between 1,500 and 2,000, is the cloud base. So you get the formation of clouds, and the bathing of the forest in these clouds becomes important in dealing with drought. There's just a whole bunch of work: remote sensing, functional traits, isotopes, ecosystem, carbon cycle work that I won't talk about. But if you're interested in any of these kinds of things in the Andes, we have a great base of data, and all of you are welcome to come visit the site and scratch any of your Andean itches. The main work that I do is measure trees. This is student and collaborator William Farfan, and we're out just measuring high precision growth bands to think about tree growth, and I'll talk about in a few minutes with migration. A lot of species discovery in the area. So there's a new species in the genus Weinmannia, and just a surprising amount. So when we started the project, there were a lot of species that were either endemic or known from one region, and that was just because things were poorly collected. And so even the things that become dominant in these areas were poorly known. For some of you, it's interesting. For North Carolina, you look at a few of these things. So Symphlocos alcornea, a few of the other species that are common at high elevation are also things that we find in nutrient poor soils here in North Carolina. And something else that's just mind-boggling. So 427 of the 1,200 or so species remain morphospecies even after they've gone to expert evaluation. So just how we understand biodiversity in these regions is difficult. The genetic work that remains to be done is huge. I always like showing pictures of plants, and so here's just a couple of things that were discovered there. And then this one was kind of a showstopper for me. So this is a dominant tree, grows to be over 100 feet tall. It's a new genus of tree. So this is Incadendron. We thought it was only from our transect. It grows within a 500 meter wide range, and you go you're below that and you'll never see it. You go above that, you'll never see it. Well, it turns out it's been found in other areas of Peru, and then in northern Peru. It's been found now in Ecuador. It's been found in Colombia. It all grows within that same 500 meter range. So just a couple of degrees C is its entire climate envelope, yet its range is the entire Andes. And when you think of Andean plants, you need to think of their ranges as a shoestring. So you can stand at the top of the range and see the bottom of the range very easily, and yet the range along the latitude of the Andes can be thousands of miles. High diversity in the system at low elevations, and then once you get up to about 1,700 or 2,000 meters, it drops off, and it drops off in a fairly linear fashion. So that's the study system. And so what I want to do is talk about the climate changes, talked about changes, forest communities and tree migration, think about the past, the climate change, think about the climate change now, and talk both in the Andes and the Amazon, and then talk about drought and its effect on canopy emergent trees. And so going back in time, this is Gaiadendron. It's related to mistletoe. It grows as a wand shrub up on the high ridge of the Andes. And we can think about, well, how was that distribution through most of the 85% of the last couple million years when temperatures were much colder than they were now. So here's one of our study areas I'm going to talk about today. This is Lago Consuelo, where the star is. You can see Lake Titicaca and Sahama ice core there. So we pack our stuff up on mules. We go into these nice tropical lakes, and we raise cores out of the mud. We look at the pollen in it. This is with collaborator Mark Bush at FIT, and we can we can reconstruct the last communities and look at how they change through time. And then we can do a standard analysis where we think about reducing the dimensionality of communities. So let them tell us about how similar they are to each other. So here's a detrended correspondence analysis. The first axis, 2 points that are close together are similar in community composition. Parts that are farther away are more different. And what you can see is for the last 50,000 years during the Pleistocene that there were oscillations, but the forest was more or less the same, and the change through any amount of time is kind of out of a constant distribution. Then about 19,000 years ago, you started to get change, but it was the same magnitude, but it all happened in one direction, and then moved over to another state in the Holocene. And we can link these to things that happened in the Northern Hemisphere. And one of the other things we can do is we can go back and use a wisdom of the crowds approach, where we can take the mean temperature that a species grows at in its modern distribution, and then do that for all the species that we encounter either on a pollen core, or as I'll show you in a second, in a forest plot, and ask them to tell us the temperature that they would vote on for that site. And if we do this in modern tree plots, it reproduces either the elevation or the temperature, because they're interchangeable, to within about 100 meters. So it does a really amazing job. And so we can use that to go back and reconstruct the temperature changes. And what we can see is that during the Pleistocene, during the depth of the last glacial, it was about 5 to 6 degrees colder in the system. And then you had this gradual change in temperature to get warmer. And as I'll talk about, probably it was certainly drier between about 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, until it settles down into the modern system. But the thing that was really striking was the rates of change. And so if you look at the rates of change per 1,000 years, it was on the order of 1 to 2 degrees C. And even in the fastest parts of the deglaciation, we're talking about 2-3 degrees C through that amount of time. And so if we think about that, we can think about that in terms of the current rates of climate change. And so down here, though, again, our eyes are drawn to high latitudes. 4 degrees C is what we're in store for. And if we go on the high carbon scenario, we might even get up to 5-7 degrees C or higher. The change is higher in the mountains. And so we can start to say, well, what does that mean if we plot it on the same graph? And the temperature change kind of takes us through the roof in terms of the rate of change. And so this led us to ask, it's really about 30 times the fastest rate of change that we can see in the pollen record. Can species remain in equilibrium? And we did a lot of work on population changes if they can't. And none of this takes into account the population projections. With the stuff I'm talking about today, it doesn't take into account the fact that there are people living in these mountains, and they have been there for at least the last 15,000 years. And so when we think about integrating land use into these systems, their roles in migration can cause pretty dire effects. All right, so how are species responding to climate change? Let's look at the observed migration. So we'll go up into the mountains and we'll use the same transect. And the neat thing about it is we have a series of plots every 250 meters going all the way out into the lowlands. And because of the lapse rate, because of the way temperature changes with elevation, we can convert that into temperatures for each of the plots. And so the short story is species are moving up, and we'll just give you a little bit of data on this. So the first way that we did this at a postdoc, a guy named King Feely, and he said, I want to take some of the stuff that we've developed for paleo work and try and look at species migration in our plots. And at that time, we had like 4 years of data. And I was like, yeah, it's a fool's errand, but go on, let's see if we can make something happen. And it came back, and it was really striking. He had made it work. And so we used tree inventory data from a 4-year interval, 2003 to 2007. And we used 14 plots spanning a couple thousand meters range in elevation. And we did 2 ways. We looked at migration by individual taxa. And so at that time, we took the most abundant genera, and more than 80% of individuals, most of the basal area. And we did just what I told you, took the mean elevation. And then we also looked at the community and the community elevation score. And we did this scenario again, as I told you, where we took the weighted average that each individual in that plot told us about the species ranges. And so as you have the deaths and recruitments, or if you incorporate basal area, the growth of the individuals, you can have the change of the community. And if those things are changing in their preferences, they come from either warmer or cooler ranges, you can look at what's now called thermophilization of these plots, so the differences between the community scores. And so what happens when you do that is that indeed a lot of these species ranges were changing. And so when we look at these, this study's been repeated many times in the tropics, all to the similar result. When we look at this, there's a wide range of species movement rates, and on average, they're about 2.5 meters a year, some up to 2.5 to 5 meters a year. And when we look at the abundant species, they're the ones that are moving the fastest. So they have a migration rate. What does this mean in terms of the past changes? Well, if we look at the observed migration rate, it's about the same as the migration rate that happened through the Pleistocene, the ones that I was telling you about before. It's not near the migration rate needed to keep up with the observed temperature change, and nowhere near the migration rate needed to keep pace with the predicted temperature change. So these species are moving, but they're not moving fast enough. And so if we think about the way ranges change, we have a range center, and then we have the extremes of the range. And so we can have an upward shift by having an expansion of the range. So the range gets bigger, the mean would shift up. We could have a contraction, so the upper end of the range could stay the same and the bottom part could shift up, or we could have a complete upward shift of the entire range. And the thing is it's many demographic processes, but if we were just looking at whether the range shifted, you'd get the similar results. And they don't even have to occur simultaneously. You can have mortality occurring on a fast scale and recruitment occurring slowly. And so one of the things we asked is, what are we observing? And if we just looked at the interval we looked at, we had a large mortality event, and it was happening right around cloud base. And so it was a large drought effect. And the effect that we saw in the migration rate, if we go back and attribute it, ended up being a mortality effect and not any change with temperature. And plants, temperature and moisture are at some parts interchangeable. And what it really looked at, like what it looks like, and I'll show you some more data in a minute, is that what was happening is plants were most moisture stressed where it was the warmest, unsurprisingly, and that's where they died. So you aren't having migration. It's like making the track team run faster by cutting all the slow kids. And so it's just a shift in those ranges through mortality. I want to give you another result. This is stuff in press. So what we did is we expanded it. So here are the plots that we were looking at in Peru. Now we looked at plots on a network of the Missouri Botanical Garden and our collaborators there in Madidi. And so we have a much larger sample and a much longer time period. And so if we look at one kind of data point on these plots, so this is the community thermophilization index, so whether the plot's telling us it's getting warmer. Here's one of the longer running plots from Cochigashu, Peru, in the lowlands, and you can see there was not much change, and then it's gotten, the community has reflected a warmer species composition through time. And then when we look at all of the plots, we can see that there's a wide variety of changes, but the preponderance is telling us that it's getting warmer, and that a lot of that warmth started to occur after the mid-2000s. So that's also slightly confounded with some installation of the higher elevation plots. And when we look at the positive community thermophilization, what we find is now we look at these rates. And so the highest rates, again, in the middle elevations. If we look in the lowlands, what we find is that there's really no mean change. And so if we look in the Amazon, the rate of change in temperature is 2 10,000ths per year. So these plots aren't changing, and their migration rates as they move up the side of the mountain are vanishingly small. Even in the Andes, the migration rates are incredibly slow. So implicating drought and mortality is a major factor. And so just to drive the point home, if we look at the current climate change, then we look at the observed, it's nowhere near what needs to happen. When we look at the demographic responses, we can attribute this to mortality, recruitment, or growth. And though it is positive, when we look at the components, mortality is the major component. And we can then start to think about what that does for biomass and changes in biomass through time. And these drought events are in 2005, 2010, and another one in 2016 are causing biomass to decrease in these plots. And they're also causing the increments, the woody increments, to decrease through time as well. All right, so observed migration, the conclusion, trees are moving up, and no matter how we measure it, we see this shift, but the movement rates are low. So the highest rates are near cloud base. They're almost non-existent in the Amazon, and it's most consistent with drought effects, or as consistent with drought effects as it is with temperature. There is some temperature based recruitment changes, but they're small compared to the death. And the process of the movement is complex. And so when we study it in this system and many other systems, we find there's no simple functional trait when we look at this, other than common. There's these interplays and this demographic decoupling that we don't have a good hand on. And the other thing is that when we look at migration, it's a landscape process and it's likely disturbance driven. So if we look at the trees that live in these plots, this is kind of a duh moment, but if we look at the juveniles of these trees, about a third of them, you'd never find the juveniles in a tree plot. And so we're ignoring, there's no way that we could see recruitment in these processes. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the Andes and the dynamics that we've been working on. So this a valley, if you were standing and looking down the valley in the Cosnipata Valley on the eastern slope of the Andes on March 3rd, 2010, it would look like this. And if you came back on March 4th, it would look like this. And so if you had, were making inference about the way that the landscape worked, you would make completely different inferences from one day to the next due to these localized episodic landslides. And when we think about the way that plants should migrate, particularly trees, they probably migrate through low competition landscapes rather than high competition landscapes. And so just to take a look, now you're standing at the bottom of the valley and then looking up the valley. And what you can see is it's a landscape dominated by landslides. Yet, when we go down and we install our tree plots, we install them on places where we can stand in a steep landscape and in an intact forest. And so one of the things to think about is how do we incorporate, in this case, airborne remote sensing to understand the full range of complexities, and then how do we understand how species move through this incredibly complex landscape. So here's just, I'm going to zoom in on one gap. And if we think about this, we can look at it in the high resolution imagery. And then also using airborne LiDAR, we've gone in and been able to characterize the landslides, the distributions of canopy openings, and look at the frequencies in the landscape. And again, what it tells us is that we're missing just a huge component of the story. All right. So how are species responding to climate change? I want to talk a little bit about the lowlands and talk about canopy emergent trees and this change in the lowlands. So if we think about what I've been talking about, we have regional drought. And here is the mean cumulative water deficit from the 2005 drought and the 2010 drought. So we go through and we look at these deep red areas. These are places where it was dry for long periods of time, where you had water that needed to be made up in the ecosystem. And if you look at the reddest part, it's centered right on our study area in Peru, and again in 2005 and also in 2010. So I want to take you down into the lowlands now and look at a place near Cochacashu biological station. And so this is the station. The lake is shaped like a cashew that gives it its name. And wanted to look at big trees. And so canopy emergent trees, trees greater around than 70 centimeters DBH, so this big all the way up into the forest giants, they store large amounts of carbon. So 30 to 50% of the carbon in any Amazonian forest plot is in 1 to 3% of the stems. It's a keystone position in the ecosystem, and it's hard to study well in these plots because these individuals, they're gigantic, but in any hectare, you might only find a couple of them. And one of the interesting results when we think about tree responses to droughts, experimental results have shown us that you would expect that the little trees would die, right? Their roots aren't very deep into the soil, and you might expect them to die. And it turns out that in experimental drying, when you remove rainfall from the trees, that it's the biggest trees that die first. And so we wanted to go in and see if this is happening in natural systems. All right, so we went along these trails. We put in about 100 hectares of plots. We have censuses in 2002 through census that's going on right now, and I'm going to present some data from. And that second census's line was supposed to talk about the droughts that were in 2010 and 2005. So here are the locations of all the trees that are in the study. And one of the interesting things was just knowing the identities of those trees. So here are crepitan, Spondius mombans, Drella odorata, these large tree emergent trees, and it's a subset of the flora. So there's 600 species of trees that enter into the tree plots just in this kind of forest, and only 88 of those get to be large. And so when we look at what's happened through time, so we had a drought event that fell in this time interval, and a drought event that fell in that time interval, one that we can argue about that fell in this time interval. So if we look at the mortality rates, that's in black, and then if we look at the recruitment rates, they're annualized rates in percent. And what we can see is that there were 1% to 2% rates, which is really high for trees this big. These trees are thought to live 200-300 up to 1,000 years, and so that's an unsustainable rate even from that first drought. But what you can see is after these droughts, the annualized mortality rate jumped up to over 4%, which is just unheard of, even for any tree in tropical forests. And so if we look at that, the canopy emergent rates, well, in the place it was measured best in Costa Rica is down below 1%. If we take all of the tree plots in the highly fertile areas of the Western Amazon, all trees of all sizes, the average rates are between a little over 1% and less than 3%. And so what's happening is you have this tremendous change in the largest trees. It's causing an acceleration in the carbon dynamics, large loss, because there are many trees bigger than 70 centimeters DBH, and the carbon scales exponentially, yet the smaller trees all enter at 70 centimeters DBH. This is another way too, where you can have rapid turnover in the community composition in the southwestern Amazon. All right, so conclusions on the Andes Amazon, the species distribution in the past was about in equilibrium with climate. You had this slow transition from the Pleistocene to Holocene, a big drought that was probably driving a lot of the species changes. Now what we see is species are moving, but they're not moving fast enough. So the mortality is a driving factor, drought and particularly temperatures. And the biggest trees are dying at spectacular rates. And when we look at the predictions for the future, so this is work that I didn't show you today, they range from dire to okay, and it depends on the assumptions about land use and fire. And when we look at the combination of temperature and land use is the most important when we have temperature changes of less than 4 degrees C. And thinking about having the tree line migrating becomes important, because if not, the trees may be able to move up, but they'll be put up against a hard barrier that's set by human interactions with the forest and burning. So what I want to do now is shift gears and then talk about ecosystem disassembly. And I want to tell you a little bit about our work on a gold rush on the Amazonian frontier. And I want to think of it as a case study in applied ecology. What I'm going to talk about is an overview of the gold rush, how we understand its scope, what's happening societally, what the tools that we use to be able to understand the problem, and then talk about interventions for governance and restoration. So this is a picture of a nugget, and I think just to give you an idea, so this is actually the plane that took the airborne LiDAR over the last section. It used to be the Carnegie Airborne Observatory, now it's the Global Airborne Observatory at Arizona State. And what you're looking at is gold mining. So this should all look like broccoli. This is lowland rainforest. And what you can see is that the land's been dug up, it's been liquefied, put through a sluice, mixed with mercury, and dumped back out onto the landscape, sometimes mined to meters deep. And it's just a vast, vast amount of destruction in the forest. And the technology that's being used is the technology that was used out in California. If you go to the museums out there, the only difference is that there weren't internal combustion engines along rivers and deep into the interior of the land. You have wildcat miners moving through and using water cannons to liquefy the soils. And again, going deep into the earth, on average 4 meters with suction pumps, but down to 6, 7, 8 meters. This is mixed with mercury. It's about 50% of the mercury is imported into the country. And when we look at it, when we look at the artisanal scale gold mining, I talk about 185 metric tons of mercury a year are put back into the environment. And this is in Madre de Dios alone. So it's mixed in. Here I have a picture. And this is something else that I don't want to leave without. When we think about the global biogeochemical cycle of mercury, we tend to think, it's burning of peatlands or it's coal or something like that. And artisanal scale gold mining is the #1 contributor to increases in the in mercury. And this is the way it's done. So you pour the mercury into you take you have used to be goat skin. It's like a little carpet now. And then you get the fine material that settles out of the sluices. You dump it into a barrel. You dump a bunch of mercury in. Somebody strips their shorts off. They get in there and they stomp it around with their feet. And then you pull that back out and you put on your personal protective gear, which is your t-shirt. And you take a blowtorch and you burn the mercury off into the atmosphere. And it's not work I'll show today, but it's actually captured by trees and surrounding intact forest, and then moved into the forest food chains and gets bound up with the carbon in there. And so if you look at bird mercury levels in areas around mining and intact forest, they're way higher than places that are far away from that. For the humans, it means that 7 out of 10 people have mercury levels that exceed the World Health Organization standard. When we look at the communities with the highest levels of mercury, they're indigenous, because they get their food from fish. Amazonian fish are highly migratory, so they're like the salmon runs or the striped bass runs, bluefish runs that we have here. Well, not bluefish. Bluefish don't breed in freshwater, but the salmon or the striped bass runs we have in the U.S. When we look at indigenous communities, even areas deep in Manu National Park, 400 kilometers away, 98% of the individuals have mercury levels that exceed World Health Organization standards. Just a little bit about what the area looks like. So looks like there's a proliferation of gold shops, and when you go into these gold shops, here's a woman. I like this slide. It encapsulates it all. So then the nuggets are heated again. That liberates the mercury to the atmosphere. She has and this is just an escape. It's not even a retort. It goes to the outside. But you can see the toys. So she's pregnant. She has a kid crawling around on the floor. The mercury levels are so high. When my colleagues take their mercury analyzers in there, it breaks them and sends them out of calibration. So the amount of mercury vapor in the air. And it's just a whole lot of bad things. We can talk about the social impacts, but what it's done is we think about it as an environmental problem, but it's also a social problem. So widespread human trafficking in this region, international mafias are attracted to places where you can make money and also have protection rackets. So it leads to a large acceleration in violence. So I want to talk to you and just show you a little bit. So this is this is how we got a handle on the scope of the problem. So we went in and were able to distinguish mining from other kinds of changes in land use. And so this is the year starting in '84. Now we're in the '90s, and you can see mining is restricted to one area, an area called Waypetwe, and then it spreads throughout the landscape. Small mining, and then through the mid 2000s, 2010, particularly after I want to call it a crisis, the recession, you started to get a lot of this. And so the orange colors of recent mining. And so what it's done is it's taken one of the wildest places in the Amazon, a place that when I started working there, if you got lost, you were a goner. You could walk for days and months and never see anyone, up against some of the largest protected areas, highest biodiversity protected areas left on the planet, and converted it into a mined landscape. And so this is just a static image of the picture. I'm going to come back and talk about words like La Pampa. This is a mining complex in places and lands that aren't titled for mining. So illegal mining, Waypetwe, which is the oldest mined area. So a place where the mining infrastructure was concentrated, then another place in Delta. One of the interesting results out of this, though, is though your eyes are drawn to these three major areas, about 60% of the mines of the area that's deforested occur in these small dispersed mines. And so when we think about restoring these landscapes, there's very different components that go into that when you're restoring large areas of landscape versus these small dispersed mines. So why did this happen? Here we can think about the deforestation from gold mining in hectares on the first y-axis, and then here's the gold price, the line. So we look at the bars. There were a couple gold rushes back in the early 90s, the mid 90s, and then really this acceleration and the area cleared by gold that happened as the gold prices went up, and the gold prices have stayed high. The economies of scale have taken place in the region, and we're now up to 150,000 hectares deforested. And if we looked at the degraded lands around that, it's about 3 times as large. If you can look at the destruction from mining that we can see when a tree is removed. So this methodology that we developed in this case requires a tree to be felled to see it. It's going down, but as I'll show you further in the talk, it turns out that people are making up for that by remining the area. So we can think about that again. So here is the Department of Madre Dios. Here's the place La Pampa, Huepeque, and Delta. This is the year that it was first mined. So we can go back, and one of the projects that we're doing is looking at natural regeneration along a chronosequence. But then we can go in and look also by having a new way of seeing when the land is moved, when the actual dirt is reworked, and being able to recover that from satellite imagery. We can see that a lot of the places, the last visit is not the same age as the first visit, that these places are reworked many, many times. And when we map this, what we can see is that these places are reworked on 4, 5, 6 times. And so when we think about the amount of mercury that's going into the environment, when we want to estimate these things, we have to take into account this reworking. So what does this look like? This is a mined landscape. You can see the sluices and the deep alteration of the soil. It leaves you something when you're done where you start to have some regeneration in some areas. This is kind of a nice microcosm. You can see it started a forestry plantation down here, and then there are these piles from the mine spoils. It leaves these lakes in the landscape. So when we think about how to recover these, it becomes an interesting problem in recovery. And then when we, there's also highly mechanized mining where you have these kinds of strip mines. One of the things that it does, and one of the reasons why this mining is so pernicious, is that most of the carbon in a tropical forest is in the soil. So if we look at a square meter of ground, or if we take a hectare of forest, the above ground carbon content is about 100 megagrams in this area. And you lose some of the bits in the soil under regular deforestation. When we look at mining, you lose there in the next meter of soil depth, there's another forest worth of carbon. And then as you go down the next 3 or 4 meters, there's another forest worth of carbon. That carbon, once you get below a meter, is on the order of thousands of years old. And so as you liberate that into the atmosphere, it's like burning coal. And so when we think about this, a hectare deforested or degraded by mining in terms of its carbon contribution is somewhere between equal to 3 to 8 hectares of carbon that's liberated above. All right. So when we look at this landscape, you tend to go back in and you think, all right, so how are we going to go in and restore this landscape? And one of the things that happens is that there's not much land left in these landscapes. So this is a picture of post-mining landscape. All of those ponds, that's not pollution, that's different diatoms that are growing in there. And what has happened is that you've created this vast Amazonian hydroscape. So this is now a picture, not of the mining, but of the surface water that's left over from the mining. And so when we have gone in and looked at these, we find that about 30% of the landscape is no longer forest, but it's actually water. So what has this done? Well, it's created some problems. So there's high rates of deforestation and biodiversity loss due to gold mining. There's widespread mercury contamination of rivers and wildlife and human communities. There's soil quality loss because you've taken everything good in the soil, you've liquefied it, and then the good stuff runs out, flows out in the river. And what you're left with is sand in a system that is used to having clayey soils. You have limited ability to produce scientifically robust data on the threats to the communities and the ecosystem. And there's low awareness and understanding of the nature of the environmental problems. You're out in the middle of a frontier, a rapidly expanding frontier, a place that in the size of Costa Rica and half of Panama put together used to have 40,000 people, now has 170,000 people by people moving in. And then so that creates some tasks. And so how do you provide information to address environmental contamination? So thinking about human health, but also biodiversity loss and landscape protection. How do you protect vulnerable groups such as indigenous women and children? And then how do you provide tools for governance in the private sector? So how do you educate the public and decision makers and avoid the fate of NGOs, which receive depth threats and were taken out of the equation and not able to operate in this and do this on expanding frontier? And so one of the things is colleagues and I, and with the help of the U.S. Agency for International Development, started the Centro de Innovación Científica Amazónica, the Amazonian Center for Scientific Innovation, or CINCIA. And we asked a question is, can you assemble as a hypothesis in development, can you assemble the scientific expertise that you need to address environmental problems on rapidly expanding tropical frontiers? And so we have this center in Peru where we're focusing on reforestation, restoration, and remediation, a large component of mercury in the environment, looking at it cycling through humans and also through animals, and also thinking about how we create education both at early levels so that we can change the way society consumes information, but also educate policymakers and have our work flow into policy. And it's been really a pleasure and a highlight of a career to work on this. So the center has a bunch of partners, and our two main partners are the Peruvian Amazonian Research Institute and the University of Madre de Dios. And what we did, as I alluded to, is that we took the Smith-Levy Act of 1912, which established the cooperative extension agencies as our model for social change. And it's been the most effective model for social change that the world has known, particularly and the reason why is that you have these new technologies that are generated by land grant institutions, or in our case, this collection of scientists that we have. And then you trial things and assume risks for people. And it's been great because we've been able to reach out to the national government, so the ministries of environment, health, agriculture, forestry, mining policy. We're deeply embedded with the regional and local government. And then all of the school kids in Madre de Dios get our curriculum. We're working to help build the university. And the other thing that I've been most proud of is that all of our study sites are on the land of miners. And so we're equally partnering with miners and people who are exploiting natural resources as with anyone else. And so I have a lot that I can tell you about Cincia and our work with that. I want to end up talking about how the work can address a social problem. So things have gotten completely out of control, right? You have mafias, all sorts of things moving in. And so the Peruvian government finally decided that instead of going in and blowing up a few miners' camps where people were mining illegally, that they were going to go in, and they were going to go in with the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Production, Forestry, not just the Ministry of the Environment, and send in the full Peruvian military, the Amazonian Defense Forces, and set up military bases in this area called La Pampa and evict the 40,000 people that were in there. And they did that without a single shot fired. And they took control of this entire area. And so then one of the questions you want to ask is, well, where did everybody go? And what was the effect of this intervention? So these are some of the camps, these huge cities that were in there, with thousands of people that were all razed to the ground. Here's a military base, and there's another one every 10 kilometers. And the way that they avoided the corruption problems is that they rotated everyone out, including the commanders, every month, so that there's no way that anyone can take bribes. And you can actually see from space where the national police work who take bribes and the military work. And so it's very different. I put this in just because we have I've been talking to a lot of people today about our drone and wildlife program up here, but we use a lot of the remote sensing work we use in the restoration comes from our drones. And of course, everybody loves to have their picture taken with a drone. So here's some of the Peruvian military guys doing that. So I just want to look at the social interventions. We had Operation Mercury. It occurred in 2019. And then we had COVID, which was an unplanned one just after 2020. And we can go in and look at the pond formation and the color to look at sediment reworking and where people are mining. And so this is the area, and this is just a current satellite image. And so you can see the destruction from space, and you can see the different sediment loads. So if we look at the river, here's one coming out of mining area, lots of sediment, one coming out of a park, no sediment. We zoom in on another area. We look up and we can see the Madre de Dios River coming in here, and then another river coming out of the river, Colorado, carrying a lot of sediment from mining. The sediment load transported in the upper Amazon has been inverted by the amount of mining that's happened. And then of course the mining ponds and the varied hues of ponds undergoing their natural limnology, and then the mining, the mine ponds. And so when we look at the pond formation, we can look at the water extent. And these top three and here are all in La Pampa, this mined area where things were illegal. When we go in with Operation Mercury, you can see that though it was rapidly growing and rapidly expanding, it stopped, and the military intervention stopped about 93%, 95% of the mining. What happened? Where did people go? Well, here is across the street. These are places that are titled for mining, but places that were having low growth in mining. And as you have Operation Mercury, you can see expansion, particularly in another area that's very close. You had almost no mining pond formation, and then that really took off. So you displaced people from places where mining was illegal and pushed them to mine in places that were legal. And then these are mining areas that are farther away, and you see really no effect of the Operation Mercury on those. Again, we tend to call this stuff leakage, but really it's a conservation, positive conservation outcome, because you're moving it at least into a place where you can have governance. COVID makes no difference in anything. It's absolutely amazing. Peru had the highest lockdowns. It didn't have any difference at all. So I've taken as much of your time as you guys will give me. So I'm going to wrap up with this. So we've gone through and we've looked at these and taking these same tools that we've looked at for Madre de Dios Peru, and we started to look around the world. There was this interesting result. It was just published in Science not that long ago by Evan DeChair, and this is work with Evan. He's a postdoc on one of our projects. And he looked at the mining all around he looked at the world. And if you look in the high latitudes, he looked at the sediment discharge, the river, every river on the planet. And at high latitudes, they're all decreasing since the 80s. And at low latitudes, they're all increasing. And so you think, well, maybe it's intensification of the hydrological cycle or something like that. And in the high latitudes, it turns out it's dams that they're taking the sediments out of the river. At the low levels, it turns out that it's artisanal mining. And this is the mining in every river around the planet. And so we've gone through, there's a paper that's reviewed every river in the tropics is mined. So this is a problem that's not just in Madre de Dios, it's everywhere on the planet. It's not all gold mining, but it's all artisanal scale mining. Much of it is gold mining. And this doesn't include aggregate mining or anything else like that. So if we look at the sediment load, so time on the x-axis, and then mining affected river kilometers, either the top one, just is it greater than the baseline? And the third one, is it more than 3 standard deviations? And then this is also broken out by area. And you can see it's just going up and up and up and up. We can look at the same thing. So just the vertical bars are different places, South America, Oceania, Asia, Africa. And you can see the increase in mining going through time. Interesting, Brazil had this problem much earlier, and they put in policies, and you can see that it's not hopeless. Like if you put in policy, their rivers went back and ran clear, and then through the between 2010 around 2016, it really picked up again. All right. So to summarize what I told you, if we think about the atmosphere and what's happening when we think about the forests, the rates of change are about 10 times higher than the last 40,000 years. So it's unprecedented challenges for forests in the Andes and Amazon. Tree species are migrating, but they're not migrating fast enough. And they're migrating up and they're hitting ecotones, moving into different kinds of habitats, into these high elevation grasslands that aren't moving at all. And all of these things rely on the biodiversity of the system, and we have very little still even understanding of that. Artisanal scale gold mining or artisanal scale mining is a major, and it's an exceptional cause of environmental and social degradation in the tropics, both through land degradation and also widespread mercury poisoning. So remote sensing tools can help understand and address the problem. And there are ways to do it. So again, there was this example in Peru where we had good translation of the science and social science into policy. And to just leave it again, as I said before, really by taking on the approach that you guys have here in with cooperative extension and land-grant institutions, it really is one of America's best innovations. And I think it's one that needs to be spread more around the world and when we think about how to address these problems through development. I guess the last thing is that this talk was not super cheery in terms of what's happening around the planet, but I think that there is some cheery outcome that comes out of this, and that is that we make all of our figures, and at 2100 they stop. And so I think it's like psychologically tells us that the world's going off a cliff in 2100, but there'll be a 2200 and a 2300. And when we think about the world that exists in that future, if we think about this jaguar swimming in a lake at Los Amigos Biological Station, there are two things that make that, it's not a cliff, it's a bottleneck. And as we don't do things that makes the atmosphere more transparent to outgoing long wave radiation, that bottleneck gets narrower. As we do things where we have land use practices that fragment the earth and destroy connectivity, that bottleneck gets narrower. But the flip side is anything you do to make that bottleneck wider allows us to take ecosystems through that bottleneck that will leave a planet that at least is compatible with life and one that we know. So I'll stop there. Thank you. You have a bunch of people to thank, so I'll just put my colleagues in Aberg and particularly colleagues in Peru and on the transect up there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Also, if there's questions on Zoom, I can read the chat.
Fantastic.
Yeah, one about tree migration. I think it's a pretty predictable question, but if you think about tree migration, it's probably it's seed dispersal, which means it's somebody else's migration, not really the tree's migration. So, and I'm sure this is in the suite of functional traits that you looked at and that didn't predict anything, but is there anything going on with like dispersal syndrome, like who the disperser is and how fast they're able to move?
Yeah. So we did it poorly, and the answer is no. And we can do it better, but I think the answer is still going to be no. And I think the reason why it's going to be no is because we really aren't looking at temperature, even though we publish all these papers saying that we're looking at temperature, because I think it's that drought-related mortality, and I don't know that you know, that will scale. I have a little section of all of the highlight reels from our camera traps in the Andes in here, and I'm happy to show it to people. But the other crazy thing about it is, except for birds and maybe one monkey, I don't believe that we understand the well, I know that we don't understand the disperser community well enough. There's all these things that we thought were obligate. So if you work in the tropics, the bush dog, right? It's the animal you've always wanted to see in the Amazon. We have them running around at 10,000 meters in the Andes. We have tyras up at tree line. Like, it's just crazy reorganization of these mammal communities. Yeah. So I'll answer it with a blustery non-answer. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to do well, particularly with bird dispersed stuff. Yeah. Yep.
What's the long-term fate of the mercury in these areas? Is it eventually get found as sort of biologically unavailable form, or is it there until it goes downstream?
The latter. Yeah, it's really interesting. So the fate of mercury is it either sinks out immediately and gets sedimented out, which is a good case, right? So, and what you hope is that, so elemental mercury is very difficult for organisms to take up, but it gets methylated once you get these lakes are anoxic. And so a lot of people use these lakes for fish farms and stuff like that. And for the first 5-6 years, they're fine. And then you get, it becomes anoxic, you get anaerobic metabolism, you get methyl mercury, which then can go through your body pretty quickly. And so it gets incorporated to bodies, and those bodies then move into the food chain, and they stay. And the Amazon and the background rates of mercury are actually pretty high, surprisingly high. And that's probably just because it's been for tens or hundreds of millions a year, tens of millions of years, a system that isn't losing mercury through export. You can volatilize it and it can blow off. I think there was a really interesting study that came out of California, and they looked at all the rivers in the High Sierra, and they modeled how long it would take to get the mercury from the gold rush down, even into San Francisco Bay, not out, and it's 10,000 years. So it's a geologic problem that you create when you do this. And like I alluded to in the talk, most of the mercury actually goes through atmospheric transport, and then you get it through dry deposition of the trees, even taken in through the leaves, that goes down, and then that gets into the forest by nutrient cycle, and then it also gets bound up in the soil carbon in those forests. And one of the perverse things is that if you then burn that forest, you're liberating an immense amount of mercury into the atmosphere. So maybe actually, if we let it all get bound up in the forest and then we burn the entire Amazon, it'll blow out into the ocean, and then it'll be someone else's problem.
another one.
Sure.
I'm trying to think historically, what makes the gold rush end? I don't know. Is it when gold runs out, or that some other social force like outweighs the value of the gold? Like if one did nothing, would this gold mining just continue until the entire Amazon is like puddles and sand, or will they run out of gold first, or like what happens if
That's right. So that's a good question. And I think it'd be really interesting to study that all around the world. And one of the things that makes gold rushes end, what made the earlier gold rushes end, is the price of gold drops to where it's no longer economically feasible to mine the gold. And so I remember back in '96 working down there, and the geologists from Mobil who were exploring for oil, there, we had a little gold rush and it went away. I remember I was like, I was a little kid, I was a grad student, and they're like, look, like the gold didn't go away. The gold content of these sediments is amazing. And when the gold prices go up, you're going to have a real problem. And they were exactly right. It took them whatever it was, 20 years, but yeah, it's amazing. So all along the base of the Andes, like there's so much gold in those sediments, it's not going to go away. And so what you have to do is find a way to mine that in a way that leaves something for the future. And that's where governance comes in. And so, anything you can do to give the tools for governance in the system, because you can mine in ways that are less destructive. You'll hear all sorts of stuff about green gold, green mining, and stuff like that. It's a fantasy, but it's the bargain we make about natural resources. We decide as a society that we're going to destroy some part of the earth, so that because we think it's economically important for us. And down there, the us is at the top levels are corruption, narcos, those international, the Croatian mafia of all people. Yeah. Well, thank you all. I'm happy to take more questions or talk afterwards, but thank you all for listening and the opportunity. Yeah.